The ultimate pursuit of human immortality in the absolute biological and psychological sense is clinically indistinguishable from premature suicide. To desperately preserve the so-called self, the human organism initiates an extreme defense protocol. It actively eradicates all neurological friction. But this spontaneous stimulation and friction is the exact physical prerequisite required to actually be alive. Watch closely how they react. A 28-year-old absolute longevity optimizer sits inside a hermetically sealed HEPA-filtered room. He just ingested exactly 40 grams of synthesized nutrients. His retinas receive zero natural light stimulation. His phone suddenly vibrates at a high frequency. It is an unplanned invitation to a gathering. His pupils instantly constrict in the visual cortex. The sympathetic nervous system immediately hijacks his body. It forcefully severs his smooth respiratory rhythm. The diaphragm elevates. Breathing shifts into a severely shallow stress response. His prefrontal cortex initiates high-energy computing, calculating the precise pathogen exposure threshold. It extracts the statistical mortality rate of nocturnal traffic. His fingers hover rigidly over the glass screen. A micro-expression of apprehension clenches his jaw. This is a textbook clinical fear response. He types out, "Can't make it, busy." His physical body collapses heavily into the ergonomic chair. The mesolimbic pathway releases a synthetic dopamine hit. This brief neural spike has zero correlation with joy. It is merely a physiological compensation for eradicating an unpredictable variable. But here is the brutal physical reality. If the foundational biological imperative is survival, at what precise neuronal threshold does this defense mutate? How does it force us to systematically murder our lived reality just to keep this biological machine idling? The cognitive realization of irreversible mortality in a hyper-technological society does not inspire any biological drive to live. It triggers a chronic low-grade trauma response. This neural trauma violently hijacks the brain, erasing the experiencing mode entirely and locking it into a pathological preservation mode. The actual fatal mechanism is the threat response. When the brain computes its own finite borders, the amygdala triggers a maximum mortality alarm, releasing toxic levels of cortisol into the bloodstream. To halt this neurochemical destruction, the prefrontal cortex is forced to overcompensate. It fabricates an immortality project, a digitally postponed horizon. Simultaneously, the anterior cingulate cortex is hyperactivated, scanning frantically for microscopic environmental risks. This defense mechanism extracts a catastrophic toll. The brain severs its dopaminergic pathways. Neural feedback for connection, joy, and art is zeroed out. The neural network rewires itself by force. It begins to misinterpret absolute boredom and safety as the ultimate neurochemical reward. Observe Armand in his early 30s interacting with his family via a VR headset. His resting heart rate is mathematically locked at 55 BPM. His mother suggests a physical visit. Instantly, his galvanic skin response violently spikes. The sympathetic nervous system registers a lethal threat. Cold sweat secretes rapidly from his epidermis. His trapezius muscles contract in extreme hypervigilance. His physical torso enters severe rigidity. He verbally rationalizes with paralyzed vocal cords. The quantum algorithms require my constant monitoring. His eyes dart away, actively severing visual contact with the avatar. He uses physical distancing to paralyze his attachment anxiety. This chronic neural blockade directly induces irreversible atrophy in the emotional centers. He has mathematically secured his biological future while becoming psychologically catatonic in the present second. And it gets worse. Merely mitigating risk is fundamentally insufficient to absolutely guarantee reaching technological salvation. The human organism must violate organic logic. It must declare an annihilating war on its present environment. The pursuit of a zero-risk operational mode demands the total eradication of environmental variance. This pathological quarantine functionally starves the brain at a neurological level. It permanently destroys the neuroplasticity required to be human. The actual fatal mechanism is sensory starvation. The locus coeruleus is the core threat detection system. It becomes hypersensitized to absolute unpredictability. The organism collapses into an obsessive, negative feedback loop. Its violent demand for biological homeostasis forces it to categorize any microscopic variable, a stranger, a pressure drop, a spontaneous emotion, as a lethal biological pathogen. This chronic neurological starvation is clinically identical to physical fasting. Stripped of tactile and spontaneous social input, gray matter density in the superior temporal sulcus plummets. Synapses in the hippocampus rapidly wither. In his desperate attempt to save the self, he structurally accelerates its physical disintegration. Watch closely how they react. It is 2 p.m. Armand is inside his reinforced rural bunker. A delivery drone suffers a micro-calibration error. It drops a package heavily against the blast door. The low-frequency vibration penetrates the reinforced concrete. His prefrontal cortex generates zero curiosity. It instantly triggers a reptilian freeze response. His respiratory muscles suffer total paralysis, triggering seconds of clinical apnea. His sinoatrial node is struck by a high-voltage impulse. Heart rate spikes to 110 bpm in 3 seconds. He stands frozen in the center of the room like a corpse. His eyes lock dead onto the security monitor. During 14 minutes of absolute dead silence, he executes zero physical displacement. Only when the thermal camera confirms a sterile perimeter does his chest cavity collapse, and as the screen returns to a flat gray, he tragically misinterprets this post-threat physiological spasm as absolute inner peace. His consciousness has been placed into permanent psychological quarantine. This physical shell has regressed into a hermetically sealed containment vessel. It accelerates its cognitive brain death through the extreme methodology of sensory deprivation. He successfully insulated his brain from the organic world. But here is the brutal physical reality. He sacrificed an entire lifetime of sensory data for a technologically supreme God. What happens when that God reveals an unpatchable neurological flaw? Digital mapping of the neural connectome captures memory, but it physically annihilates the biological somatosensory loop. The literal biochemical sensation of being alive is gone. The actual fatal mechanism is the severed interoception. Consciousness is not a cold hard drive of static files. It is the dynamic emergent property of biochemical feedback, heavily reliant on the continuous firing of the insular cortex. Uploading perfectly maps the static synaptic topology, but brutally cuts the blood supply. The brain suddenly processes a freezing truth. Consciousness cannot be continuous. The upload is merely a perfect digital clone. The original carbon host must undergo absolute physical death. This cognitive realization triggers acute ontological shock. The ultimate defense mechanism he spent a lifetime building shatters. Against the physical reality of death, the organism loses all psychological padding. Watch closely how they react. Armand is now 87 years old, staring dead at a holographic livestream. The CEO of Samsara clinically reads the final test data. The original self-awareness is confirmed lost. Armand's nervous system instantly triggers severe depersonalization. Capillaries in his face undergo extreme vasoconstriction. Blood is violently drained from the epidermis. His peripheral vision rapidly collapses. The visual field degrades into a pitch-black tunnel. His physical body slumps into the chair like dead weight. Extensor muscles lose all foundational tone. His hands erupt into uncontrollable, violent tremors. The chronic cortisol baseline he maintained for 70 years suffers a catastrophic adrenaline crash in 1 second. His jaw hangs slightly open, but his vocal cords are entirely paralyzed. He stares blankly at the pale wall. His cerebral cortex undergoes violent abnormal discharges, attempting to compute the absolute deletion of his entire life's purpose. This results in irreversible psychological annihilation. He realizes he traded 80 years of carbon-based life for a digital ghost, and it gets worse. Stripped of this protective delusion, the dying biological machine is left completely naked, facing the exact ultimate terror it ran from its entire existence. With precisely 0 seconds left on the physical clock, he learns that death is not a system bug patched by quantum computing. It is the absolute hard-coded protocol for human consciousness. But here is the brutal physical reality. Remove the physical compression of finite time, and the brain's reward centers lose their firing threshold, meaning making structures instantly crash from understimulation. The chemical drive for neural connections drops to zero. Armand never cheated death in any dimension. He functionally experienced brain death at age 20. For the next 74 years, he deployed extreme biochemical defense protocols to meticulously embalm a breathing corpse. Immediately, cease the hyper-optimization of your trajectory. The sterilized zero-risk future does not exist. You must actively inject microscopic physical risks and neurological friction back into your operating system. Accept the uncalculated invitation today. Execute physical displacement without a predefined coordinate. Force your physical body into unquantifiable, inefficient labor. Mandate your prefrontal cortex to process high-density unpredictability. The clinical metric for a successful biological organism is never the duration it maintains a resting heart rate. It is the absolute density of its collision with chaotic reality. The clinical definition of living is risk exposure. Every other evasive maneuver is simply an organism hibernating while waiting for the loading bar to end. If this forced teardown of the human operating system triggered acute physiological discomfort in your body, that is an optimal clinical indicator that your sympathetic nervous system is still online. You still possess authentic vital signs. Subscribe to this channel. We do not distribute synthetic futuristic placebos here. We exclusively map the brutal, unvarnished architecture of reality. Thank you for engaging with this transmission. Prepare your consciousness for the next evolution. See you in the next deep dive into the human condition.